good whatever time of day it is. I'd like to welcome you to the first week of class here at Science Fiction Literature. I have a couple announcements I'd like to make before we get started. I've uploaded a couple of documents to the timeline, and I'd like you to take a look at them. One is the course syllabus. You should already have it in your email, but if not, it is available there. Please take the time to read it over and really look at it. I took a long time to write it. I hope you take the time to read it. The second document is a resource for you for your papers. It explains how to use the academic form properly, what a thesis statement is, what an introduction is, what a body paragraph should do, what a conclusion should do. Now, I know you've probably already learned that in English 100. However, this will be a very beneficial resource to you. It's a good reminder, and I think it'll help you out a lot. With that said, why don't we get down to business and get to talking about class.
What is criticism?
Criticism is a tool that you can use to discover the meaning of a text, or the possible meanings of a text. What you have to realize is no text has a specific meaning. We often put the burden of importance on the author. But the author isn't the sole interpreter of a work. Readers can make up their own minds as well, and sometimes authors aren't aware of what they're writing or what they're trying to say. Roland Barthes, the French critic, invented this term called the death of the author. This idea suggests that the author is dead for our purposes. In order to understand a text, we don't need the author to tell us what it's about.
How do we do it?
You perform criticism by doing a careful, close reading of a text. A close reading is an examination of a text, a document. Whether it's the Declaration of Independence or one of the novels from this class, you can perform that quite easily. All you need to do is take a look at each line, or one line in particular. What we're doing when we do a close reading, essentially, is we're breaking down the ideas in each and every word and seeing how they combine with the next word in order to create meaning. The French critic Jacques Derrida coined the term difference and différance. Basically, this idea suggests that in order for us to make meaning out of words and sentences, specifically in phrases, we have to see not only what the first word is, but also the next word. Because whenever you have a sentence or a phrase, the first word has meaning by itself, and it has a whole host of meanings, a whole bunch of possibilities. But it has to differ from the next word in order to create meaning, right? Hence difference. But also, it defers that meaning to the next word as well, différance. So we combine those two ideas to sort of figure out what that author is trying to say, or what the text is trying to say more specifically. So we would use this tool and break down a phrase or a sentence or a number of sentences and examine individual words, right, and how they sort of collide with other ones. Because remember, words don't have just one meaning as much as we'd like to think so. Majority of times, if you look a word up in a dictionary, it'll have multiple meanings, each maybe similar, right? Sometimes we have homophones or things like that, but majority of cases, it's one word and each definition is similar, but slightly different. So using those possibilities, we can create a possible meaning for a text and then make some kind of inference or some kind of decision about it and decide what it's trying to tell us, or what we believe it's trying to tell us.
What is new?
New Historicism looks at a text as a product of its time. A terrific example of that, or a good metaphor that we can use here, is the rippling pond. Imagine that history is a pond, right? And someone tosses the rock in. That rock is the text, right? It creates ripples into that pond, and those ripples spread out and continue, throughout time, essentially. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about New Historicism. It's essentially this text, this one particular piece, is making these reverberations throughout the culture, throughout history. But it's not only that. It's also going the reverse. Historicism, we can see not only does the author create those waves, but there's also waves going back into the author. right? The things he or she and the text are a product of their time. They're responding to things that are being done around them. For example, if we were to look at one of Shakespeare's plays, let's take The Tempest, for example. I know some of you may have not read it, but it's an excellent example. It's a story that takes place on an island, right? And there's these indigenous people that this man Prospero sort of makes his slaves, and some other characters crash there. And typically people looked at it as some kind of fantasy because there's fantastical elements into it. But that's not the case, at least through a new historicist eyes. The Tempest was written during a time when the British Empire was expanding. We can use that information and infer that Shakespeare is responding to the colonial expansion of the British Empire and its imperialism. Combine these two methods, close reading on the one hand, and on the other hand, new historicism, and sort of figure out some kind of meaning for each text. And that's what I expect you to do with all of the texts that we'll be reading, whether it's Brave New World or The Watchmen. One of the general questions we'll be exploring in this class is, what is science fiction? As a genre, it's only existed in the last 100 years or so. And if we go a bit further back, we can point to examples like We Are Here, like Shelley, Wells, Verne. And we can even look further back to people like Jonathan Swift, or even some of the ancient Greeks. They all had fantastical, sciencey elements. But typically, people don't start that clock ticking until Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is often credited as the founder of science fiction, or the grandmother, if you will, because she incorporates elements of science, or what was seemed plausible during her day. Of course, to our eyes, that's not necessarily plausible anymore. You can't bring a body back to life with electricity. At the time, there were experiments ongoing where people use electricity to bring or reanimate beings back to life. Now, they weren't actually bringing them back to life. They were just reactivating dead nerve cells through the use of electricity. So it seemed plausible, right? And that's sort of why we pick her as our grandmother of science fiction. And it doesn't matter who you point to after her. Whether it's Huxley or Heinlein or Alan Moore, all of those authors are doing that same thing. They're looking at what are possibilities. Another term for science fiction is speculative fiction, and it's one that's quite fitting when we look at it from that point of view. Now, Mary Shelley doesn't just bring us Frankenstein. It's not the only work that she wrote that is science fictional, if that's a term. But she also wrote another book called The Last Man, which looks at a plague that wipes out civilization, where this one person is the last man. That's the title. Keep that in mind later on in the semester when we'll be reading I Am Legend, where it's a very similar case, except in this case, the plague has turned people into vampires. Jules Verne, a French writer, is another good example of early science fiction. Many of his novels dealt with the fantastical, what seemed scientifically plausible, and even to an extent, he's been proven somewhat accurate. I'll use that loosely. Verne also wrote a number of novels which helped cement the conventions of science fiction. In particular, books like Voyage to the Moon. Wells is another great example of early science fiction. His novels like War of the Worlds used not only what he thought was possible, that is to say Martian invaders, but also to show that science was also beneficial to our society. In the case of War of the Worlds, the novel ends when the aliens die of the common cold. Other novels of his, like The Invisible Man, also explored these science fictional ideas. So after this brief introduction, I'd like you to take a moment and go ahead and take a look at the links in the timeline and start reading them. You can use this lecture in conjunction with those links. This is only to be an introduction. Those links will give you far more information than I can. So that's pretty much it.